Sometimes the hardest choice we face is between what others expect of us and what our heart knows is right. In the frontier town of Red Mesa, Josette Hale stands at the altar, about to marry a man she doesn't love to save her family from ruin. The church is packed with expectant faces, but her heart feels hollow as an old mine shaft. Then the heavy oak doors crash open with a sound like thunder. The church falls silent as every head turns toward the massive figure in the doorway. Asa Colt walks down the aisle, his boots echoing on wooden floors, until he stops right in front of the bride. "My wagon stage leaves in 5 minutes," he says, for everyone to hear, "with or without you." But when love collides with duty on the unforgiving frontier, will 5 minutes be enough to change 2 lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 hours before Asa Colt would stride through those church doors, the morning sun painted Red Mesa in shades of amber and dust. The town stretched along the valley floor like a string of mismatched beadswooden storefronts, weathered gray by desert winds, adobe houses with clay tile roofs, and the grand stone church that dominated the main square, with its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a pointed finger. Josette Hale stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom, watching her reflection as 2 women fussed over the ivory silk dress that would seal her fate. The gown had belonged to her mother, altered now to fit Josette's slender frame, though it felt more like a burial shroud than wedding attire. Pearl buttons marched up her spine in perfect formation, each one fastened with the precision of a military drill. "Hold still, dear," murmured Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress, her mouth full of pins. "We want everything perfect for your special day." Special. The word tasted bitter as alkali water. Josette's fingers traced the delicate lace at her throat, remembering her mother's stories about this dress, about love that bloomed naturally like desert wildflowers after rain. That kind of love seemed as distant as the snow-capped mountains visible through her window. "You look beautiful, Josette." Her cousin Martha stepped back to admire their handiwork. "Mr. Blackwood is a fortunate man indeed." Fortunate. Another word that sat wrong in Josette's chest. Cyrus Blackwood was 43 years old, with silver threading his black hair and cold grey eyes that calculated profit margins instead of seeing beauty. He owned 3 railroads, 2 banks, and enough political influence to buy senators like penny candy. What he wanted now was respectability, a young wife to display at social functions and bear him legitimate heirs. What he didn't want was love. That suited him fine, since Josette had none to give. Through the window came the sounds of preparation hammers striking wood as men erected tables for the reception, the clip-clop of horses, bringing guests from neighboring ranches, the excited chatter of children who saw any celebration as cause for joy. The whole town buzzed with anticipation. Red Mesa hadn't seen a wedding this grand since the territorial governor's daughter married 5 years past. A gentle knock interrupted her brooding. "Come in, Uncle Samuel." Samuel Hale entered slowly, his shoulders bearing the weight of more than his 58 years. Once, he'd been a man of substance, owner of the town's only bank, respected member of the city council, a pillar of the community. Now his brown suit hung loose on his diminished frame, and deep lines carved worry into his weathered face. "You look lovely, my dear." His voice carried genuine affection mixed with something that might have been regret. "Your mother would be proud." Josette turned from the mirror, studying the man who'd raised her after her parents died in the cholera outbreak 12 years ago. Samuel had been more than an uncle. He'd been father, protector, and friend, which made his betrayal all the more painful. Would she? Josette's voice remained calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Would mother be proud of her daughter being sold to pay debts? The words struck Samuel like physical blows. He aged another decade in the span of a heartbeat, sinking into the chair beside her dressing table. "Josette, please. You know it's not that simple." "Isn't it?" She moved to the window, gazing out at the preparations that felt more like funeral arrangements. "The banker's ledger tells a clear story, Uncle. Bad investments, loans called in early, creditors circling like vultures. And then Cyrus Blackwood appears. With his solution, marry his niece and all debts disappear. Samuel's silence confirmed what she already knew. The leather-bound ledger downstairs contained the mathematical proof of their desperation. Numbers written in her uncle's careful script, each entry another step toward ruin. Until Blackwood's offer changed everything. There were other options. She continued, her reflection ghost-like in the window glass. I could have taken the teaching position in Denver. We could have sold the house, started fresh, somewhere new. And lived in poverty? Samuel's voice cracked with emotion. Josette, you're 22 years old. You deserve better than scraping by on a teacher's wages, better than watching everything your father built crumble to dust. I deserved a choice. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of borrowed songs, each one beautiful but never truly its own. Josette understood that feeling. Tell me about him, she said finally. About Asa. Samuel's head jerked up as if she'd slapped him. What? Asa Colt, the boy you sent away 3 years ago. Josette turned from the window, her blue eyes steady and uncompromising. The one you paid to leave town and never come back. Color drained from Samuel's face. How did you? I found the bank draft. Your handwriting, Asa's signature. $500 and a promise never to contact me again. She moved closer, her silk skirts whispering across the wooden floor. Did you really think I'd never discover the truth? Samuel stood abruptly, pacing to the far wall where Josette's childhood drawings still hung in simple frames. Pictures of horses running free across endless plains, of couples dancing under star-filled skies, of dreams that seemed possible when the future stretched wide as the horizon. Asa Colt was trouble, he said without turning around. Son of a drifter, no prospects, no future. He would have dragged you down with him. He loved me. Love doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. Samuel spun to face her, desperation making his voice harsh. What could he offer you? A life of hardship, following cattle herds from one dusty town to another. You're educated, refined. You deserve silk dresses and fine china, not cooking over campfires and washing clothes in muddy streams. Josette's laugh held no humor. And what does Cyrus Blackwood offer? A gilded cage with silver bars. Security, comfort, a place in society. Everything except happiness. Samuel's shoulders sagged. Happiness is a luxury we can't afford. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they watched a wagon loaded with wedding gifts roll to a stop in front of the house. Crystal glasses caught the sunlight, throwing rainbow fragments across the dusty street. Expensive offerings from people seeking favor with Cyrus Blackwood silver, tea sets, imported china, bolts of fine fabric. All beautiful, all meaningless. 3 years, Josette murmured. 3 years since you sent him away, and still every sunset makes me think of his smile. Every storm reminds me of his laughter. Do you know what that's like, Uncle? To carry someone in your heart like a sweet ache that never heals. Samuel's own pain showed clearly now. I thought you'd forget. I hoped. He stopped, unable to finish. You hoped I'd learn to love money more than joy. Josette smoothed her skirts, the silk cool and foreign beneath her palms. But some things can't be bought or sold or reasoned away. Mrs. Patterson bustled back in with the veil, its lace as delicate as spider webs. Time to finish preparing, dear. The ceremony begins in 2 hours. As the older woman arranged the veil over Josette's dark hair, Samuel caught his niece's eyes in the mirror. There's something else you should know about Asa Colt. What? He didn't take the money. Josette's heart stopped. What do you mean? The bank draft. It was never cashed. I found it among some old papers last week, still signed, but never deposited. Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. Whatever his reasons for leaving, it wasn't greed. The revelation hit Josette like a physical blow. All these years, she'd wondered if Asa had chosen money over love, if $500 had been enough to make him abandon what they'd shared. Now she knew the truth he'd left for other reasons, carrying his love like a burden too heavy to set down. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because in 20 minutes you'll walk down that aisle and speak vows that can't be undone. I want you to know." Samuel's voice broke completely. "I want you to know that whatever mistakes I've made, they came from love. Misguided, perhaps, but love nonetheless." Josette studied her reflection one final time. The woman in the mirror looked elegant and composed, every inch the bride society expected to see. But behind her blue eyes burned something wild and untamed, something that 3 years of careful living hadn't been able to extinguish. "I forgive you, uncle," she said softly, "but forgiveness doesn't change what must happen next." Samuel frowned. "What do you mean?" Before Josette could answer, church bells began to ring across the valley, their bronze voices calling the faithful to witness a sacred union. One by one, the sound echoed off canyon walls and mesas, returning as whispers of everything that might have been. The wedding of Miss Josette Hale to Mr. Cyrus Blackwood was about to begin. What none of them knew was that somewhere in the desert beyond town, a lone rider urged his horse toward Red Mesa, racing against time and destiny, carrying love in his heart and determination in his soul. The future balanced on a knife's edge, and the smallest breath of wind might send it tumbling in directions no one could predict. The church organ wheezed its opening notes as 200 souls packed into wooden pews, their Sunday best, creating a sea of dark fabric and nervous anticipation. Josette walked down the center aisle on Uncle Samuel's arm, her steps measured and deliberate, despite the chaos in her chest. The weight of every gaze pressed against her like a physical thing. Curious neighbors, business associates of Blackwood's, ranch families who'd traveled 50 miles to witness this union of money and necessity. At the altar waited Cyrus Blackwood in his finest black suit, silver watch chain gleaming across his vest like a badge of prosperity. His pale eyes tracked her approach with the satisfaction of a man claiming a prize long coveted. Beside him stood the territorial judge who would perform the ceremony, his weathered face solemn with the gravity of binding 2 lives together. Josette's fingers trembled against her uncle's arm as they reached the front of the church. Samuel's face was pale as cemetery marble, guilt and love warring in his expression as he prepared to give away the girl he'd raised as his own daughter. Behind them, the congregation rustled with expectation, programs fanning faces in the morning heat. "Dearly beloved," Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the holy union of—" The massive oak doors exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Every head turned as one toward the back of the church. Silhouetted against the brilliant desert sunlight stood a figure that seemed carved from the landscape it sprawled, shoulders blocking the doorway, dusty boots planted wide, a black hat shadowing features that had haunted Josette's dreams for 3 long years. Asa Colt. He stood motionless for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Then he began walking down the aisle with the deliberate pace of a man who owned every step he took. His spurs rang against the wooden floor like a death knell, each footfall echoing in the stunned silence. He'd grown taller in their years apart, broader through the shoulders and chest. The boy she'd known had been replaced by a man shaped by hard work and harder choices. His face bore new lines carved by sun and wind. His hands showed the calluses of labor. But his dark eyes, those eyes she'd memorized like scripture burned, with the same intensity that had once made her believe in forever. "What is the meaning of this?" Cyrus Blackwood's voice cracked with outrage. "How dare you interrupt?" Asa didn't spare him so much as a glance. His attention remained fixed on Josette as he approached the altar, stopping just 3 feet from where she stood frozen in her wedding dress. The silver pocket watch that had belonged to his father caught the light as it swayed from his vest chain, the same watch he'd shown her once, promising that someday he'd have time enough to court her properly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that somehow managed to ignore everyone else in the building. His voice had deepened, roughened by years of calling to cattle across vast distances, but it still carried the gentle warmth that had once made her feel like the only woman in the territory. You, Josette's voice failed her completely. 3 years of wondering, of dreaming, of trying to forget, and here he stood as real as sunrise. I know I'm late, Asa continued, his dark eyes never leaving her face. I know I should have come sooner, should have fought harder, should have never let them send me away. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you to trust me one more time. Behind him, the congregation erupted in whispers and gasps. Ladies fanned themselves frantically while men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some recognized Asa from his youth in Red Mesa, others saw only a dusty cowboy disrupting proper society. All sensed they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. Remove this man immediately. Blackwood's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. Sheriff, where is the sheriff? The sheriff's been called away on urgent business, Asa said without turning around. Seems there was a disturbance at the silver mine. Terrible shame he couldn't be here for such a momentous occasion. Josette's mind reeled. The casual way Asa mentioned the sheriff's absence suggested this was no coincidence. He'd planned this moment down to the smallest detail, orchestrated it like a military campaign. The realization sent electricity through her veins. Josette, Uncle Samuel whispered urgently, think about what you're doing. Think about our family's future. But Josette was already thinking about the bank draft Asa had never cashed, about 3 years of sleepless nights wondering what might have been, about the choice between security and the wild freedom of following her heart across unknown territory. My wagon stage leaves in 5 minutes, Asa said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent church. With or without you. The words hit the congregation like a physical blow. Several ladies gasped audibly. Men sat forward in their pews, sensing drama that would eclipse any dime novel. At the altar, Judge Morrison stood frozen with his mouth half open, his ceremony reduced to forgotten words. This is preposterous, Blackwood sputtered. You can't simply walk into a church and steal a man's bride. I'm not stealing anyone, Asa replied calmly. I'm offering a choice. His eyes remained locked on Josette's, speaking volumes in the language they'd developed during stolen moments 3 years past. In their depths she saw apology for his absence, promise of adventure, and love, dear God. The love was still there, burning like a beacon in the darkness of her arranged future. Josette. Her name on his lips was both question and prayer. What do you say? The church held its collective breath. 200 souls waited for her answer, but in that moment only 2 people existed, a woman in white silk standing at the crossroads of her life, and a man in dusty trail clothes offering her the world. She thought of her mother's stories about love that bloomed naturally. She thought of the teaching position in Denver she'd been forbidden to take. She thought of Cyrus Blackwood's cold calculation and her uncle's desperate mathematics. Then she thought of trust, of choosing joy over safety, of writing her own story instead of letting others dictate the chapters. Slowly, deliberately, Josette reached up and removed the delicate lace veil from her hair. The congregation gasped as she let it flutter to the floor like a surrender flag, its intricate patterns settling against the wooden planks with barely a whisper. 5 minutes is more than enough time, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the stunned church, when you know where your heart belongs. She stepped away from the altar, away from Blackwood's shocked face and her uncle's anguished expression, away from the life that had been chosen for her. With each step toward Asa, she felt invisible chains falling away like autumn leaves. Asa's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He offered his arm with the same courtly grace he'd shown when they were young and the world seemed full of possibilities. Shall we go see what adventures are waiting down the road? Lead the way, Mr. Colt. Together they turned toward the church doors, toward the brilliant desert sunlight and whatever lay beyond. Behind them, chaos erupted as Blackwood shouted for justice. Uncle Samuel called her name in desperate entreaty, and 200 voices rose in a cacophony of shock and speculation. But Josette heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the solid warmth of Asa's arm beneath her hand, and the sound of their footsteps echoing in perfect rhythm as they walked toward an uncertain but chosen future. The great doors swung wide, framing them in golden light as they stepped from the shadows of expectation into the blazing reality of love reclaimed. Outside waited a wagon loaded with supplies and hitched to two strong horses, evidence of Asa's careful planning and absolute faith that she would choose him. As they climbed onto the wagon seat, the church bells began to ring not in celebration of a union blessed by society. But as an alarm sounding the end of everything Red Mesa thought it knew about proper young ladies and their place in the world. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks in the desert sand as Red Mesa fell away behind them, the church bell still clanging its frantic alarm. Josette gripped the wagon seat with white knuckles, her wedding dress billowing in the hot wind like a flag of surrender to convention. Every muscle in her body vibrated with the magnitude of what she'd done, abandoning family, security, and respectability for a man she hadn't seen in 3 years, and a future as uncertain as tomorrow's weather. Asa drove with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life reading landscapes and calculating distances. His hands were gentle but firm on the reins, guiding the horses along a faint trail that led northeast toward the distant mountains. The silver pocket watch bounced against his vest with each jolt of the wagon, marking time like a metallic heartbeat. "Where are we going?" Josette asked, having to raise her voice above the wind and the creak of leather harness. "Colorado Territory," Asa replied without taking his eyes from the trail ahead. "I've got a claim up there, good water, sweet grass, land that'll support cattle and dreams both. It's about a week's hard travel if we push steady and don't run into trouble. And if we do run into trouble?" His smile was grim. "Then we deal with it when it comes. Right now, we need to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever Blackwood's cooking up." As if summoned by his words, the sound of galloping hooves echoed off the canyon walls behind them. Josette twisted in her seat to see a cloud of dust rising from the direction of Red Mesa riders and coming fast. "How many?" Asa asked, already urging the horses to greater speed. "I can't tell, the dust's too thick, but it looks like more than just a search party." Asa's jaw tightened. "Blackwood moves faster than I figured, probably offered a bounty to every man in town with a horse and a gun." The wagon lurched as they hit rougher ground, but the horses were strong and fresh. Asa had chosen them well-matched pair of bays with the wind and stamina for long distances. Still, they were pulling a heavy load against mounted riders with blood up and money on their minds. "There," Asa pointed to a narrow canyon opening ahead. "If we can reach those rocks, we'll have cover and better defensive ground." The pursuing riders were gaining steadily, their shouts carrying on the desert air. Josette could make out individual figures, now at least 6 men, maybe more, riding hard and carrying rifles. Among them rode Deputy Marshal Hendricks, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "They've got law with them," she called over the thunder of hooves and wheels. "Bought law," Asa corrected grimly. "Hendricks has been in Blackwood's pocket since the railroad came through. He'll call this kidnapping and try to take you back by force if necessary." The canyon mouth loomed ahead, its red stone walls promising shelter but also potential trap. If their pursuers reached the entrance before they could find a way out the other side, they'd be pinned like cattle in a pen. Asa guided the wagon between towering sandstone formations, their walls rising like cathedral spires on either side of a narrow passage barely wide enough for the vehicle. The hoofbeats behind them echoed strangely in the confined space, multiplied and distorted until it sounded like an army of pursuit. "There," Josette pointed to a wider area ahead, where the canyon opened into a natural amphitheater. "We could make a stand there." "That's exactly what I was thinking." Asa's eyes found hers. And in that moment she saw not just the boy she'd known, but the man he'd become, someone who'd learned to read danger and make hard choices without flinching. "But I need you to know what you're risking. These men aren't playing games. If shooting starts, then we'll face it together." Josette's voice was steadier than she felt, but the words came from some deep well of certainty she hadn't known existed. I chose this path, Asa. I chose you. Whatever comes next, I'm not running anymore. He reined the horses to a halt in the center of the amphitheater, where ancient flood patterns had carved smooth benches in the rock, and sparse vegetation clung to life in the shade. It was defensible ground cover from multiple directions, and only one way in or out. "Can you shoot?" he asked, reaching under the wagon seat to pull out a rifle and a cloth bundle that proved to contain ammunition. "Uncle Samuel taught me. I'm not Annie Oakley, but I can hit what I aim at." "Good enough." He handed her the rifle, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch sent electricity up her arm. 3 years hadn't dimmed the connection between them. "Stay low, pick your targets, and don't hesitate. These men aren't here to discuss the weather." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like approaching thunder. Asa positioned himself behind a fallen boulder, while Josette found cover near a cluster of barrel cacti, her white wedding dress making her feel conspicuous as fresh snow against the red rock. "Colt!" Deputy Marshal Hendrick's voice boomed through the canyon. "Come out with your hands visible and the woman unharmed. You're under arrest for kidnapping and disturbing the peace." "Nobody's been kidnapped," Asa called back. "The lady made her choice freely in front of 200 witnesses. Blackwood says different. Says you threatened her family and forced her compliance. Either way, she's coming back to face proper justice." Josette felt anger flare in her chest, the casual assumption that her choices needed male approval, that her voice in the matter carried no weight. She'd spent her whole life being told what was best for her, what was proper, what was expected. No more. "I speak for myself," she shouted, surprising both Asa and their pursuers. "I'm 22 years old and of sound mind. I chose to leave that church, and I choose to stay with Asa Colt." A moment of silence followed, then Hendrick's voice again, colder now. "Ma'am, you're obviously under duress. Mr. Blackwood's willing to overlook this temporary lapse in judgment if you come peaceful-like. Otherwise, we'll have to use force to ensure your safety." The sound of rifles being cocked echoed through the canyon. 6 men with weapons against 2 people with 1 rifle and whatever pistol Asa might be carrying. The mathematics weren't encouraging. But as Josette crouched behind the cacti, feeling the desert wind lift her dark hair and tug at her silk skirts, she realized something had changed inside her. The scared girl who'd stood at that altar was gone, replaced by a woman who'd finally claimed her own destiny. Whatever happened next, she'd face it with her eyes open and her heart free. "Your move, Hendricks," Asa called. "But understand this, we're not going back." The deputy's answer came in the form of a rifle shot that spanged off the rocks above their heads, sending stone chips flying like angry hornets. The gunfight lasted 20 minutes and settled nothing except that both sides were serious about their intentions. When the last echo faded from the canyon walls, 2 of Hendrick's men nursed wounds, while Asa sported a crease across his left shoulder that bled freely but didn't seem to slow him down. Most importantly, they'd proven that pursuing the runaway couple would cost more than Blackwood's bounty money was worth. "This ain't over, Colt," Hendricks shouted as his men helped the wounded back onto their horses. "Blackwood's got connections all the way to Denver. You'll never outrun what's coming." "Then I guess we'll have to outfight it instead," Asa called back, checking the cylinder of his Colt revolver with practiced ease. As the sound of retreating hooves faded, Josette emerged from behind the cacti to examine Asa's shoulder. The bullet had torn through his shirt and carved a shallow groove in the muscle, painful but not dangerous if kept clean. "You need tending," she said, reaching for the water barrel secured to their wagon. "It'll keep until we're farther from town." Asa's eyes remained fixed on the canyon entrance, watching for signs of renewed pursuit. "We've got maybe an hour before they regroup with more men and better planning." They climbed back onto the wagon seat, Asa wincing slightly as he gathered the reins. Josette noticed he favored his right arm now, compensating for the wound without complaint. The silver pocket watch had acquired a new dent from a ricochet, but it still ticked steadily against his vest. "Tell me about Colorado," she said as they rolled deeper into the maze of canyons and mesas. "About this land you're claiming." Asa's expression softened, the hard edges of combat giving way to something that might have been hope. It's in a valley about 2 days north of Colorado Springs. Sweet grass as far as you can see, a creek that runs year-round, and mountains all around like God's own fence posts. The previous owner died without heirs, so the territorial government opened it for homesteading. How big? 640 acres. If I can prove it up properly, build a house, run cattle, show that I'm making the land productive. He glanced at her sideways. It's not Red Mesa society, Josette. It's hard country that asks everything of folks who try to tame it. I'm not afraid of hard work. The words surprised her with their conviction. A week ago, she'd been worried about choosing the right china pattern for her wedding reception. Now she was discussing cattle ranching like it was the most natural thing in the world. I know you're not, but there's a difference between knowing something in your head and living it with your hands. Asa guided the wagon around a massive boulder that had tumbled from the canyon rim centuries ago. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away. The nearest town is a day's ride. Winter comes early and stays late, and the only law is what you make with your own 2 hands. Josette thought about this as they traveled, the reality of her choice beginning to settle like sediment in still water. She'd traded silk dresses for homespun, china teacups for tin mugs, social calls for endless days of isolation. But she'd also traded security for freedom, predictability for adventure, and empty respectability for love. They stopped at sunset beside a natural spring that bubbled up from underground and created a small oasis in the desert waste. Cottonwood trees provided shade while their horses drank deeply, and Asa finally allowed Josette to clean and bandage his shoulder wound. "Hold still," she murmured, tearing strips from her silk petticoat to make proper dressings. The fabric was expensive and beautiful, imported from San Francisco at considerable cost. Now it served a more practical purpose. "I'm sorry," Asa said quietly as she worked. "For getting shot, that's hardly your fault. For all of it. For leaving 3 years ago. For staying away so long. For dragging you into this mess." His dark eyes were serious in the firelight. "You could have had a comfortable life with Blackwood. Rich husband, fine house, respect in the community." Josette's hands stilled on the bandage. "Is that what you think I wanted?" I hoped." He struggled with the words. "I knew what I wanted, but I couldn't be sure what you wanted. Rich banker's daughter and a cowboy with more dreams than Dollarcit doesn't make sense on paper." "Then it's a good thing life isn't lived on paper." She finished tying the bandage and sat back on her heels. "Asa, I need you to understand something. I didn't run away from a bad situation. I ran toward something better. Toward you, toward us. Toward the chance to build something real together." In the flickering firelight, she could see the boy she'd fallen in love with, and the man he'd become superimposed, like double-exposed photographs. The same gentle eyes, but older now, and marked by experiences she could only guess at. The same strong hands, but scarred now by rope and weather and hard work. "What happened?" she asked softly. "After you left Red Mesa, where did you go?" Asa poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. "North, mostly. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, saved every penny I could scrape together. Spent a winter in Wyoming that nearly killed me, and a summer in Kansas that made me appreciate why people fight over water rights." He reached into his vest and pulled out the silver pocket watch, its surface now bearing the fresh dent from their encounter with Hendricks. But there was something else hidden in the back of the case. Protected by glass was a small tintype photograph of a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes. Josette's photograph, the one he'd asked for before leaving Red Mesa. "I carried you with me," he said simply. "Every mile, every job, every night under strange stars. You were the reason I kept going when everything else seemed hopeless." She reached for the watch, her fingers tracing the familiar curves of her own younger face. "Why didn't you write? Why didn't you try to contact me? What could I offer? Love and uncertainty and a future that might never come." Asa's voice was rough with old pain. "Your uncle was right about one thing you deserved better than following a broke cowboy from one temporary job to another. That wasn't your choice to make." I know that now. He closed the watch case with a soft click. Took me 3 years to realize that denying you the choice was worse than risking your rejection. Josette studied his face in the firelight, seeing the weight of loneliness and regret he'd carried. Here was her grandmother's ring, hidden in her dress pocket, the only thing of real value she'd brought from her old life. She pulled it out now, a simple gold band, set with a small diamond that had belonged to 3 generations of women who'd chosen love over convenience. "This was my grandmother's," she said, holding it so the firelight caught the small stone. "She gave it to my mother, who was supposed to give it to me on my wedding day, but it was never meant for a marriage of convenience." She held out her hand to Asa, her meaning clear. "Some choices are worth waiting for." 3 days into their journey across the high desert, the landscape began to change from redstone canyons to rolling hills covered in sage and scattered juniper. They'd been pushing hard since dawn, trying to reach the trading post at Bitter Creek before their supplies ran too low. Josette had learned to read the rhythm of travel, when to rest the horses, how to conserve water, why Asa always chose their campsites with an eye toward defense and escape. She'd also learned that love looked different under an open sky than it had in stolen moments behind her uncle's house. There was no privacy for romantic declarations, no comfort for intimate conversations. Everything was practical now, sharing warmth during cold nights, rationing food and water, taking turns standing watch while the other slept. But in the small gestures, she found something deeper than the passion of their youth, the way Asa always made sure she had the largest portion of food. How he'd quietly spread his bedroll upwind to shield her from blowing sand. The careful way he helped her up and down from the wagon, mindful of her inexperience with rough travel. "Storm coming," he said, squinting at the western horizon where dark clouds were building like an army preparing for battle. "Big one, by the look of it." Josette followed his gaze. The clouds were still miles away, but already she could see veins of lightning flickering in their depths like trapped electricity. The air had grown heavy and still, with that peculiar quality that came before violent weather. "How long before it hits us?" 2 hours, maybe 3 if we're lucky. Asa urged the horses to greater speed, though they were already showing signs of fatigue. "We need to find shelter. This country doesn't forgive folks caught in the open during a real blow." They crested a low hill and saw their salvation in the distance, a cluster of weathered buildings beside a creek that sparkled like quicksilver in the afternoon light. The trading post at Bitter Creek looked like civilization after days of empty landscape, though Josette had learned not to trust appearances in this country. "Something's wrong," Asa said as they approached. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle propped beside his knee. "What do you mean?" "Too quiet. This time of day there should be activity. Horses in the corral, smoke from the chimney, folks moving about, but look, everything's buttoned up tight as a coffin." Josette studied the buildings more carefully. The main trading post was a long, low structure built of adobe and timber, with smaller outbuildings scattered around it like chicks around a hen. But Asa was right, no smoke rose from the chimney, no horses stood in the corral, and the windows were shuttered despite the afternoon heat. Could they have seen the storm coming and taken precautions? Maybe, but Asa's voice suggested he didn't believe it. "Stay close and keep that rifle handy. Something's got these folks spooked." They rolled into the trading post's dusty yard as the first rumble of thunder echoed across the hills. The storm was closer now, close enough that Josette could smell rain on the wind, that sweet, dusty scent that came before desert downpours. A door opened cautiously, and an elderly man emerged with a shotgun cradled in his arms. His weathered face was deeply lined, his beard more gray than black, but his eyes were sharp as cut glass. "That's far enough, strangers," he called. "State your business and move along. We're closed for the day." Asa raised his hands to show they were empty. "Easy, friend. We're just travelers looking for supplies and shelter from the storm. Got hard money to pay for what we need. Don't matter what you got, we're closed, and that's final. Ben Travers, you old fool." A woman's voice came from inside the building. "Can't you see they're just trail, Weary folks looking for help. Put that scattergun away before you hurt someone." The old man, Ben Travers, looked torn between caution and embarrassment. "Martha, you don't understand. After what happened yesterday—" "What happened yesterday?" Asa interrupted, climbing down from the wagon with his hands still visible. "Maybe we can help." "Help?" Travers laughed bitterly. "Mister, unless you're packing badges and warrants, there ain't nothing you can do about our trouble." A plump woman with steel-gray hair emerged from the trading post, wiping her hands on a flour sack apron. Her face was kind but worried, the expression of someone who'd seen too much hardship lately. "I'm Martha Travers," she said, "and this suspicious old goat is my husband Ben. We run this post, or we did until yesterday when our troubles caught up with us." "What kind of troubles?" Josette asked, climbing down from the wagon despite the uncertain welcome. Martha's eyes took in Josette's travel-stained wedding dress with understanding that needed no explanation. The kind that comes with hired guns and legal papers. Railroad companies been pressuring folks all along this route to sell their land for next to nothing. Those who won't sell have been having accidents. "What kind of accidents?" Asa's voice had gone quiet and dangerous. "Wells poisoned, buildings burned, cattle shot and left to rot." Ben Travers spat in the dust. "Yesterday, they sent 3 men to make us a final offer. When I refused, they said we had 1 week to reconsider before things got unfriendly." Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. The horses snorted nervously, sensing the approaching storm in ways humans could only guess at. "Ben, get those folks inside before we all get soaked," Martha said. "Storm or no storm, I won't have it said that Martha Travers turned away travelers in need." They hurried the horses into the stable and carried their essential supplies into the trading post just as the sky opened up. Rain came down in torrents, turning the dusty yard into a temporary lake and drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Inside, the trading post was warm and welcoming despite the Travers' troubles. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything. Frontier travelers might need ammunition, preserved food, tools, fabric, medicine. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, filling the air with the rich scent of beef and vegetables. "Railroad company, you said." Asa accepted a cup of coffee from Martha, his expression thoughtful. "Which one?" "Rocky Mountain and Pacific," Ben replied. "Big outfit with connections all the way back to Washington. They're building a spur line through this country, and our post sits right where they want to put their depot." Josette felt ice form in her stomach. "Rocky Mountain and Pacific, that's one of Cyrus Blackwood's companies." The Travers exchanged glances. "You know Blackwood?" Martha asked. "He was supposed to be my husband," Josette said simply, "until 3 days ago when I ran away with Asa instead." Ben whistled low. "Well, that explains a few things. Word came through yesterday on the telegraph Blackwood's offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to your return. Dead or alive, though he'd prefer alive." The words hit Josette like a physical blow. $1,000 was more money than most frontier folks saw in a year. It would turn every stranger into a potential threat, every trading post into a possible trap. "That's not the worst of it," Martha said quietly. "The men who came here yesterday, they had a photograph. A wedding picture taken in Red Mesa just before the ceremony was interrupted. They know exactly what you both look like." Outside, lightning flashed and thunder shook the building. But the storm inside Josette's heart was worse, the growing realization that their escape had made them targets in a game much larger and more dangerous than she'd imagined. The storm raged through the night, turning creeks into rivers and trails into muddy traps. By morning, the world looked washed clean, but their situation had grown more complicated. Ben Travers had spent the dark hours pacing and muttering, while Martha worked quietly at her stove, cooking breakfast with the methodical precision of someone using familiar tasks to manage fear. "Can't stay here," Asa said over coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. "Every hour we linger puts you folks in more danger." "And where will you go?" Ben asked. "Every trading post, every town, every ranch between here and Colorado will have that photograph by now. Blackwood's got the telegraph lines humming with your descriptions." Josette fingered the compass rose necklace that Asa had given her the night before, a simple silver pendant on a leather cord, nothing fancy but beautiful in its plainness. He'd carved it himself during the long winter in Wyoming, he'd said, thinking of her and the direction his life needed to take. "There are other ways to travel," she said quietly. "Paths that don't go through towns or trading posts." "Indian trails," Martha nodded. "But that's dangerous country for white folks, especially now. There's been trouble with renegade bands all summer." "More dangerous than Blackwood's bounty hunters?" Asa asked. Ben considered this. "Maybe not, but you'd need a guide, someone who knows the old routes, and you'd need to travel light, no wagon, just what you can carry on horseback." "I know someone," Martha said suddenly. "My nephew Tommy's been trading with the Ute bands for years. Speaks their language, knows their ways. He might be willing to guide you for the right price." "Where is he?" "Should be coming through here today or tomorrow. He runs a circuit through this country, carrying goods to the remote settlements." Martha refilled their coffee cups. "Course, that's assuming you're willing to trust your lives to a half-breed kid who's never been more than 50 miles from where he was born." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Ben grabbed his shotgun while Asa moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. "3 riders," he reported, "coming in slow and careful like they're expecting trouble." "That'll be Tommy," Martha said with relief. "He always brings 2 pack animals when he's making the circuit." But when the riders came into full view, Josette's blood turned to ice water. The man in the lead wasn't the young guide they'd been expecting. It was Deputy Marshal Hendricks, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Behind him rode 2 men she didn't recognize, both carrying rifles and wearing the hard expressions of professional manhunters. "Back door," Ben whispered urgently. "Through the storeroom there's a trail that leads up into the rocks." Asa was already gathering their supplies, moving with the quick efficiency of someone who'd learned to pack fast and travel light. "What about you folks? Hendricks won't believe you haven't seen us." "We'll handle Hendricks," Martha said grimly. "Been dealing with his type for 30 years. You just worry about getting away clean." Josette grabbed the few personal items she'd brought from Red Mesa, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the compass rose necklace that already felt like a talisman. Everything else would have to be left behind, including the wedding dress that had become both symbol and burden. "This way." Ben led them through the cluttered storeroom toward a door that opened onto the hillside behind the trading post. "Follow that deer trail up through the rocks. About 2 miles north, you'll find an old line shack that's been abandoned for years. Wait there until dark, then decide your next move." "We can't thank you enough," Josette began, but Martha cut her off with a fierce hug. "Don't thank us, child. Just live free and love true. That's thanks enough for any decent person." They slipped out the back door as Hendricks and his men approached the front. Josette could hear the deputy's voice, carrying on the morning air, demanding information with the authority of bought law and unlimited resources. The climb up through the rocks was treacherous, made worse by loose stone and patches of mud left by the night storm. Josette's town-bred legs burned with the effort, but she pushed on without complaint. Behind them, she could hear raised voices from the trading post, Ben's stubborn denials and Hendricks' growing frustration. They reached the line shack just as a gunshot echoed from below. Asa grabbed Josette's arm, his face pale with concern for the people who'd helped them. "We have to go back," she said, "if they're hurt because of us." "Then going back won't help them," Asa said firmly. "All we can do now is make sure their sacrifice means something." The line shack was a single room built of logs and chinked with mud, designed to shelter cowboys during roundup season. It was empty now except for a broken chair and some old horse tack, but it offered concealment and a view of the trail they'd followed. Through the single window, they watched Hendricks and his men search the area around the trading post. One of them had found the tracks their horses had left in the mud, but the rocky ground above had concealed their actual direction of travel. "They'll figure it out eventually," Asa said. "Hendricks isn't stupid, just corrupt. We need to keep moving." Where? Every trail leads to somewhere they'll be watching. Asa studied the compass rose necklace around her throat, its silver surface catching the filtered sunlight. Martha was right about the Indian trails. It's dangerous, but it might be our only chance. Without a guide? I spent 2 years working for a trader up in Montana. Learned some tracking, some wilderness skills. Not enough to make me an expert, but maybe enough to keep us alive. Josette looked out at the vast wilderness stretching toward the distant mountains. Somewhere out there lay Colorado, and the land Asa had claimed, the future they'd dreamed of building together. But between here and there stretched hundreds of miles of territory, where a wrong turn could mean death from exposure, hostile tribes, or the endless pursuit of men who saw them only as a bounty to be collected. "We'll need different clothes," she said practically. "I can't travel rough country in silk and petticoats." Asa smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since their escape from Red Mesa. "There's a trunk in the corner that might have something useful. Cowboys sometimes leave extra gear in these shacks." The trunk yielded treasures. A pair of wool pants that would fit Josette with some adjustment, a cotton shirt that had seen better days but was still serviceable, and a worn leather vest that would provide protection from thorns and weather. Most importantly, there was a second compasson old brass instrument that still pointed true north. As Josette changed into her new traveling clothes, she caught sight of herself in a broken mirror propped against the wall. The elegant young lady from Red Mesa was gone, replaced by someone who looked capable of surviving whatever the wilderness might throw at her. "Ready?" Asa asked. She tucked the compass rose necklace inside her shirt, feeling its weight against her heart like a promise. "Lead the way, Mr. Colt. Let's go find our future." They traveled for 3 days through country so wild it seemed untouched by human hands, following game trails and creek beds that led steadily north toward Colorado territory. Asa's wilderness skills proved better than he'd claimed. He found water when the creeks ran dry, identified edible plants when their food supplies dwindled, and read the landscape like a book written in stone and sage. But it was the 4th morning that changed everything. They'd made camp in a hidden canyon where a spring bubbled up from underground, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwoods. Josette was washing their clothes in the clear water, while Asa studied an old map he'd carried since his Montana days, trying to calculate their position and plan their route. "Someone's coming," he said suddenly, his hand moving to his rifle. Josette listened but heard nothing except wind in the trees and the gentle splash of water over stones. "Are you sure?" "Single rider, moving careful, like through the rocks above us, been shadowing us for the last hour." Asa's eyes never left the canyon rim. Could be a scout for a larger party, or someone traveling alone who's curious about strangers in his territory. The rider appeared on the eastern rim, like a figure materialized from the red stone itself, a young man mounted on a paint horse, carrying a rifle across his saddle, but not pointing it in any threatening manner. His skin was sun-darkened, his black hair worn long beneath a battered hat, and his clothes were the practical mix of white man's goods and Indian craftsmanship that marked him as someone who lived between 2 worlds. "You folks lost?" he called down, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Just passing through," Asa replied, keeping his own rifle visible but not aimed. "Looking for the trail north to Colorado Springs." The young man laughed. "Colorado Springs is 200 miles that direction, and there ain't no trail where you're headed. Nothing but badlands and Apache hunting parties for the next 50 miles. He guided his horse down into the canyon with the casual skill of someone who'd been riding rough country since childhood. Up close, Josette could see he was younger than he'd first appeared, maybe 25, with intelligent dark eyes and the lean build of someone who lived by his wits and wilderness skills. "Name's Tommy Brennan," he said, touching the brim of his hat to Josette. "My Aunt Martha at Bitter Creek said I might run into you folks up here." Relief flooded through Josette. "You're Martha's nephew the guide," she mentioned. "That'd be me." But Tommy's expression was serious, despite his casual manner. "Though I got to tell you, guiding you to Colorado ain't going to be as simple as Martha figured. Things have changed since you left the trading post." "What do you mean?" Asa asked. Tommy dismounted and let his horse drink from the spring. Hendricks and his boys tore that place apart, looking for sign of which way you went. When they couldn't find nothing useful, they got frustrated and rough. Ben tried to run them off with his shotgun. Josette's heart clenched. Is he? He's alive, but just barely. Hendricks put a bullet in his leg and would have done worse if Martha hadn't pulled a derringer and backed them down. But that ain't the worst of it. Tommy pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, not wanted posters this time, but something that looked like a survey map covered in red ink markings. What is it? Asa asked. Railroad survey map. Fell out of one of Hendricks' saddlebags during the ruckus. Martha managed to grab it before they noticed. Tommy spread the map on a flat rock where they could all see it clearly. Take a look at this. The map showed the territory from Red Mesa north to the Colorado border, with a planned railroad route marked in red ink. But it wasn't the route that made Josette's blood run cold. It was the detailed surveys of specific land parcels, each one marked with ownership information and estimated values. And there, circled in red ink with notes written in a careful hand, was Asa's Colorado claim. Section 18, Township 12 North, Range 4 West. Tommy read aloud. 640 acres, proven water rights, excellent grass, strategic location for depot construction. Current claimant, Asa Colt, address unknown. Estimated value for railroad purposes, $50,000. The numbers hit like a physical blow. $50,000 more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to build a railroad empire or buy a small army. That's impossible, Asa said. It's just ranch land, good grass and water, but nothing special. Tommy pointed to a series of dotted lines that crossed directly through Asa's property. See these marks? That's the planned route for the main line from Denver to California. Your land ain't just good for ranchingits, the perfect spot for a major depot and switching yard. Control that property, and you control rail traffic through the entire territory. Josette studied the map more carefully, seeing her worst fears confirmed in red ink and careful surveying. This isn't about a jilted groom seeking revenge. It never was. What do you mean? Asa asked. Cyrus Blackwood didn't want to marry me for love or even respectability. He wanted to marry me to get information about you, about your land claim. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Uncle Samuel must have mentioned your Colorado property when he was negotiating the marriage terms. Blackwood realized what it was worth and saw a way to eliminate a potential obstacle. Tommy nodded grimly. Makes sense. Marry the banker's niece. Get social standing and information both. When you ran off with Colt instead, he had to switch to more direct methods. The bounty, Asa said slowly. It was never about bringing Josette back. It was about making sure I never reached Colorado to file my claim. Dead or alive, Josette whispered, remembering Martha's words. He'd prefer alive, because then he could force you to sign over the land rights. But dead would work just as well, harder to file claims from the grave. The spring morning suddenly felt cold, despite the warming sun. They'd been running from what they thought was personal vendetta, but they'd actually stumbled into the middle of a corporate war over land rights worth a fortune. There's more, Tommy said reluctantly. According to this map, Blackwood's company has been buying up property all along the planned route. Sometimes legitimate purchases, sometimes through intimidation and violence. Your land is the last major piece they need to control the whole corridor. Asa stood and paced to the edge of the spring, his reflection fractured by the moving water. So what are our choices? Keep running forever, or go back and fight a railroad baron with unlimited resources? There might be a third option, Tommy said. The Territorial Land Office in Colorado Springs. If you can get there and file your final claim papers, establish legal ownership, then Blackwood can't just take the land by force. He'd have to go through the courts, and that would take years. And if we can't reach Colorado Springs? Tommy folded the map carefully. Then Blackwood wins. He gets the land, the railroad gets built, and you two become footnotes in someone else's success story. Josette picked up a smooth stone from beside the spring and turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight and texture. Such a small thing, but it had been shaped by forces beyond imagination, water and wind and time itself. Now she and Asa faced forces just as vast and impersonal, but they had something the stone didn't, the power to choose their own fate. "How long to reach Colorado Springs?" she asked. "2 weeks if we push hard and don't run into trouble. A month if we have to dodge bounty hunters and railroad agents the whole way. And the chances of making it without being caught or killed." Tommy's honest eyes met hers. "Maybe 1 in 3, if we're smart and lucky both." Asa returned from the spring's edge, his decision already made. "Then we'd better be the smartest and luckiest folks this territory has ever seen." Josette smiled, feeling something fierce and wild rising in her chest. "When do we leave?" "Now," Tommy said, already moving toward his horse. "Every hour we delay gives Blackwood more time to position his people between us and Colorado Springs. If we're going to do this thing, we need to do it fast and quiet." As they broke camp and prepared for the most dangerous part of their journey, Josette touched the compass rose necklace beneath her shirt. It pointed steadily north, toward their dreams and the land that was worth more than they'd ever imagined. The question now was whether they'd live long enough to claim it. The final approach to Colorado Springs took them through country that seemed designed by a malevolent god to test human endurance. Rocky passes where a single misstep meant death, desert stretches where water was more precious than gold, and always the constant awareness that somewhere behind them, professional killers followed their trail with the patience of wolves. Tommy proved to be everything Martha had promised, and more. He knew every waterhole, every game trail, every place where travelers could find shelter from both weather and pursuit. More importantly, he understood the delicate politics of a territory where white settlers, Mexican ranchers, and various Indian tribes created a shifting web of alliances and hostilities. "Smoke ahead," he said on their 13th day, pointing toward a thin column rising from the valley below. "That's Colorado Springs. We made it." But Asa's expression remained grim as he studied the terrain through an old spyglass he'd carried since his Montana days. "Made it to the outskirts anyway. Getting into town and filing those papers is going to be the hard part." He was right. Even from this distance, they could see riders positioned at strategic points around the settlementmen, who sat their horses with the casual alertness of sentries, watching every trail that led toward the territorial land office. "Blackwood's people?" Josette asked. "Has to be. Probably been here for days, waiting for us to show up." Tommy accepted the spyglass and made his own survey of the situation. "I count at least 8 men in position to watch the main approaches. Could be more we can't see from here." They made camp in a grove of aspens that provided concealment while they planned their approach. Asa's father's rifle lay across his knees, its worn wooden stock polished smooth by generations of careful hands. The weapon had belonged to his grandfather before that, carried through Indian wars and cattle drives, always maintained in perfect working condition. Now it might be called upon to defend dreams as well as lives. "Tell me about the land office," Asa said to Tommy. "Layout, security, the kinds of people who work there." "Single-story building on Main Street, right next to the bank. Territorial clerk named Morrison handles most of the filings, honest man, but nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. There's usually a deputy marshal around during business hours, but he's more concerned with drunks and thieves than land disputes." "What about back entrances, other ways to reach Morrison without going through the front door?" Tommy scratched his chin thoughtfully. "There's an alley behind the building, but it's narrow and easy to watch. Better might be to create some kind of distraction, draw attention away from the land office while you slip in and file your papers." "What kind of distraction?" Josette asked. "Something loud and attention-getting, but not so dangerous that innocent folks get hurt." Tommy's eyes held a spark of mischief that reminded Josette of her own childhood pranks. "I've got some ideas, but they'd require perfect timing and a fair amount of luck." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they refined their plan. It was risky to the point of being foolhardy, dependent on split-second timing and the assumption that Blackwood's men would react predictably to chaos. But it was the only chance they had. Once we start this thing, there's no going back, Asa warned. If something goes wrong, if we get separated, don't try to rescue anyone else. Just get to that land office and file those papers. And if you don't make it, Josette's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Then you file the claim in your own name. As my intended wife, you'd have legal standing to homestead the property. Asa reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded documentis, original land claim papers, signed and notarized back when the future seemed simpler. I've already added your name as co-claimant. Whatever happens tomorrow, that land will be legally yours. Josette took the papers with hands that trembled slightly. The documents represented everything they'd risked their lives, for not just land, but the freedom to build something together without interference from men who saw human dreams only as obstacles to profit. There's something else, she said quietly, something I should have told you days ago. Both men looked at her with questioning eyes. I'm not completely helpless in a fight. Uncle Samuel didn't just teach me to soothe, taught me to think tactically. After my parents died, he was determined that I'd never be defenseless if trouble came calling. She pulled a small derringer from her boot, its pearl handle gleaming in the firelight. I know it's not much compared to rifles and 6 guns, but up close it's as deadly as anything. Asa stared at her with a mixture of admiration and surprise. You've been carrying that this whole time. I've been carrying a lot of things this whole time. Fear, determination, love. She met his eyes across the flickering flames. And the absolute certainty that I'd rather die free with you than live safely without you. Tommy cleared his throat diplomatically. Speaking of safety, we should probably try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and we'll need all our wits about us. They bedded down under the stars, taking turns on watch as they had every night since leaving Red Mesa. But sleep came hard, and when it did come, it was filled with dreams of gunfire and pursuit, of legal documents signed in blood, and of a future that balanced on the edge of a knife. Josette woke before dawn to find Asa sitting beside the cold ashes of their fire, his father's rifle across his knees and his eyes fixed on the distant lights of Colorado Springs. In the pre-dawn darkness, he looked younger somehow, more like the boy she'd fallen in love with years ago. Having second thoughts? She asked softly. Third and fourth thoughts. This plan has more ways to go wrong than right. He turned to look at her, his expression serious but resolute. But I keep coming back to the same conclusion. We've come too far to turn back now. Even if it kills us? Even then, some things are worth dying for, Josette. Freedom, love, the right to choose your own path. Those aren't just words. They're what's separate living from merely existing. Tommy stirred from his blankets, instantly alert in the way of men who'd spent their lives in dangerous country. Time? Hour before sunrise, Asa replied. Perfect timing if we move now. They gathered their gear in silence, each person focused on the role they'd play in the coming drama. Tommy would create the distraction that drew Blackwood's men away from the land office. Asa would provide cover and backup, using his rifle to keep enemies at bay, while Josette made her way to file the claim papers. It was a plan that required courage, timing, and more than a little luck. But as they prepared to ride down into the valley where their fate waited, Josette felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she'd made her choices freely and followed her heart without compromise. The compass rose necklace hung warm against her throat, its silver surface catching the first rays of dawn as they mounted their horses and began the descent toward Colorado Springs. Behind them lay hundreds of miles of desert and mountains, weeks of hardship and pursuit, a trail marked by the blood of good people who'd helped strangers in need. Ahead lay the territorial land office and the legal documents that would make their dreams real if they could reach them alive. Ready? Tommy asked, his young face serious with the weight of responsibility. Ready. Asa and Josette replied in unison. They rode down from the mountains as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of hope and promise. 3 people against impossible odds, carrying the future in their hearts and the past at their backs. In 1 hour, they would either be landowners with a legal claim to their dreams, or they would be dead. Either way, they would face it together. The distraction began at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, when Tommy Brennan rode into Colorado Springs leading a pack horse loaded with what appeared to be stolen goods from a recent Indian raid. He made sure to approach from the south, drawing the attention of every one of Blackwood's watchers as he shouted warnings about Apache war parties and missing cavalry patrols. "Massacre at Willow Creek," he yelled, his voice carrying across the dusty main street. "Whole wagon train wiped out. Armies forming up a relief column." The effect was instantaneous. Men poured out of saloons and shops, some seeking news, others preparing to defend the town. More importantly, 4 of Blackwood's sentries abandoned their positions to investigate this new threat, leaving gaps in their surveillance that Asa and Josette could exploit. They moved like shadows through the back alleys of Colorado Springs, using buildings and wagons for concealment as they worked their way toward the land office. Josette carried the claim papers tucked inside her shirt, the documents that would make their dreams legal if they could just reach the territorial clerk alive. "There," Asa whispered, pointing to a narrow gap between 2 buildings that would bring them out directly behind the land office. 50 yards, and we're home free." But as they prepared to make their final dash, a familiar voice called out from the street behind them. "Well, well, if it isn't the runaway bride and her cowboy lover." They turned to find Cyrus Blackwood himself, standing in the mouth of the alley, flanked by 2 professional gunmen whose hands rested casually on their weapons. The railroad baron looked exactly as Josette remembered: cold grey eyes, expensive clothes, and an air of absolute certainty that money could solve any problem. "Hello, my dear," Blackwood said to Josette with mock courtesy. "I do hope you've enjoyed your little adventure in primitive living. I'm sure you're ready to return to civilization now." "I'm exactly where I belong," Josette replied, her hand moving toward the derringer in her boot. "I think not. You see, this romantic escapade has caused me considerable inconvenience. Damaged my reputation, cost me money, complicated my business dealings." Blackwood's voice remained conversational, but his eyes were ice cold. "I'm afraid I can't allow it to continue." "The lady's made her choice," Asa said, his hand drifting toward his gun. "Time for you to accept it and move on." Blackwood laughed. "Choice? My dear boy, choice is a luxury reserved for people with power, people like me. You're nothing but a broke cowboy with delusions of grandeur, and she's a foolish girl who needs guidance back to proper behavior." "And the land?" Josette asked. "What about the $50,000 in railroad development you're trying to steal?" For the first time, Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "I see you've been doing some detective work." "Yes, your boyfriend's little ranch is worth considerably more than he imagined. But that doesn't change the fundamental equation. I have the resources to take what I want, and you don't have the power to stop me." One of his gunmen shifted position, trying to get a better angle for a clear shot. Asa noticed the movement and adjusted his own stance, his hand now hovering inches from his Colt revolver. "Funny thing about power," Asa said calmly. "Sometimes it comes down to who's willing to risk everything for what they believe in." Pretty words, but bullets don't care about noble sentiment. Blackwood nodded to his men. "Kill the cowboy. Take the woman alive if possible, but don't let her reach that land office." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 armed men facing 2 people whose only advantages were desperation and love. Then Josette did something that surprised everyone. She laughed. "You know what your mistake was, Cyrus?" she said, pulling the derringer from her boot with lightning speed. "You assumed I was the same helpless girl who stood at that altar in Red Mesa." She fired twice in rapid succession, not at the gunmen, but at a stack of wooden crates behind them. The sound of splintering wood was followed immediately by the angry buzz of disturbed hornets, dozens of them, boiling out of a nest that had been hidden in the cargo. Chaos erupted as the gunmen found themselves under attack by insects that showed no respect for expensive clothes or professional reputations. In the confusion, Asa drew his pistol and put a bullet through the shoulder of the nearest hired killer, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. "Run!" he shouted to Josette, laying down, covering fire as Blackwood's remaining gunman tried to bring his rifle to bear, despite the hornets swarming around his head. Josette sprinted toward the land office's back door, the claim papers clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, she could hear gunshots and shouting, the sounds of a fight that would determine everything they'd worked for. The back door was locked, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She threw her shoulder against the wooden panel, felt it give slightly, then hit it again with everything she had. The door burst open just as a makeshift wedding ring, fashioned from a bent horseshoe nail, caught the morning light on her finger. Asa's promise, given during their flight across the desert, that their love would be forged strong under pressure. Josette burst through the back door of the territorial land office to find herself face to face with a startled clerk who dropped his coffee cup at her sudden appearance. Papers scattered across his desk as he jumped backward, his eyes wide with shock at the dusty, armed woman who'd just broken into his normally quiet office. "Don't move," she said, pointing her empty derringer at him with hands that shook from adrenaline. "I need to file a land claim, and I need to do it right now." "Ma'am, proper procedure," the clerk stammered, his thin face pale with confusion. "My name is Josette Hale, and this is a legal homestead claim for Section 18 Township, 12 North, Range 4 West." She slammed the documents onto his desk, the papers that represented everything she and Asa had risked their lives to preserve. "I demand you process this filing immediately." Outside, the sounds of the gun battle continued. She could hear Asa's voice shouting orders to Tommy, the crash of overturning furniture, and the angry buzz of hornets that had turned a calculated confrontation into pure chaos. The clerk's nameplate read, H. Morrison stared at the documents with the horrified fascination of a man watching his quiet world collapse into violence and disorder. "Ma'am, there are procedures forms to fill out, fees to pay, verification requirements." "The fees are right there." Josette pointed to the gold coins Asa had included with the papers every cent they'd saved for this moment. "And as for verification, I'm standing right here verifying that this claim is legitimate." Morrison's hands trembled as he picked up the documents, his clerk's training warring with his basic survival instincts. "But ma'am, there's gunfire outside. Shouldn't we wait until—" "If we wait, I'll be dead and you'll be out of a job." Josette moved closer to his desk, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Do you know who Cyrus Blackwood is?" "Of course. He owns the Rocky Mountain and Pacific Railroad." "And do you know what he does to people who stand in the way of his business interests?" She gestured toward the sounds of violence filtering through the walls. "That's him out there, trying to kill the rightful owner of land he wants to steal. If he succeeds, how long do you think it'll be before he decides that territorial clerks who've seen too much are also obstacles to be removed?" The color drained from Morrison's face as understanding dawned. His hands moved with sudden urgency, pulling out official forms and reaching for his pen. Name of claimant, Asa Colt and Josette Hale, joint ownership. Description of property. Section 18, Township 12 North, Range 4 West, 640 acres, with proven water rights. Morrison scribbled frantically, his pen scratching across the official forms with desperate speed. Outside, a window shattered, and someone screamed in pain. The sounds of combat were getting closer. Improvements made to the property, boundary markers established, water sources surveyed, grazing areas identified. Josette was making up details now, but they sounded official enough to satisfy a terrified clerk who just wanted to complete the transaction and survive the day. Duration of residence. 6 months continuous habitation. Another lie, but Morrison was too frightened to question it. A bullet crashed through the front window, embedding itself in the wall above their heads. Morrison yelped and ducked behind his desk, but his hands never stopped moving across the paperwork. "Sign here," he said, thrusting the forms toward Josette. "And here, and initial there." She signed with a steady hand, despite the chaos around them, each signature bringing their dreams closer to legal reality. As she wrote Josette Hale for the final time, the back door exploded inward, and Asa stumbled into the office, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes blazing with determination. "Is it done?" he gasped. Almost. Morrison was applying the official territorial seal to the documents, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep the stamp straight. "Just need to record the filing in the official registry and—" The front door burst open, and Cyrus Blackwood strode in, his expensive suit torn and his face dark with rage. His remaining gunman followed, nursing a hornet sting that had swollen his left eye nearly shut. "Stop!" Blackwood commanded. "I forbid this filing. That land claim is fraudulent." Morrison looked up from the registry book, his pen poised over the final entry. "Sir, these documents appear to be in order. I have no legal authority to—" "I'll give you legal authority." Blackwood pulled a small pistol from his vest pocket and aimed it at the terrified clerk. "Step away from that registry book or I'll paint the wall with your brains." Morrison froze, his pen trembling in his hand. The official deed stamp lay on the desk beside the completed forms, so close to making their claim legal, but still one signature away from completion. "You're too late, Blackwood," Asa said, though his own gun was empty and his rifle lay somewhere in the alley behind them. "The papers are signed, the fees are paid, and the claim is filed." "Not until it's recorded in the official registry," Blackwood snarled. "And that's not going to happen." But he'd forgotten about Tommy Brennan, who chose that moment to crash through the front window in a shower of glass and wood splinters. The young guide rolled to his feet with a cavalry saber in his hand, apparently liberated from some unlucky soldier during the earlier chaos. "Surprise!" Tommy grinned, his blade catching the morning light as he faced Blackwood's remaining gunman. The hired killer spun toward this new threat, giving Asa the opening he needed. He lunged across the office and tackled Blackwood around the waist, sending both men crashing into the wall. The railroad baron's pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, raining plaster down on the struggling forms below. Morrison needed no further encouragement. His pen flew across the registry book, recording the claim with the desperate speed of a man who'd seen too much violence for one morning. "Filed!" he shouted. "Official as of—" he consulted his pocket watch. 8:47 in the morning, July 15th. He slammed the deed stamp down on the final document with a sound like a judge's gavel, and suddenly the room fell silent, except for the heavy breathing of exhausted combatants. Blackwood pushed himself up from the floor, his expensive clothes torn and his dignity in ruins. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I have lawyers, political connections, influence, and we have legal ownership," Josette interrupted, holding up the stamp deed that made their claim official. "Recorded in the territorial registry and witnessed by a government official. Try to steal our land now, and you'll be fighting the law itself." Tommy lowered his saber, grinning at the railroad baron's discomfort. "Funny how different things look when the law's on the other side, ain't it?" Blackwood's remaining gunman had quietly slipped out through the broken window, apparently deciding that his employer's money wasn't worth facing federal charges for interfering with legal land claims. The railroad baron found himself alone, outnumbered, and for the first time in his adult life, completely outmaneuvered. "You think this changes anything?" he said, but his bluster rang hollow in the destroyed office. "I'll find other ways to get what I want." "Maybe," Asa replied, moving to stand beside Josette. "But you'll have to do it legally now. No more hired guns, no more intimidation, no more buying corrupt officials to do your dirty work." Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sir, as a territorial official, I'm obligated to report this incident to the federal marshal's office. Attempted murder, destruction of government property, interference with legal proceedings, those are serious federal crimes." The last of Blackwood's composure cracked. "You wouldn't dare." "Actually, he would," Tommy said cheerfully. "See, Morrison here's got a brother who works for the Denver newspapers. Be real interesting to see what the territorial governor thinks about railroad barons trying to murder homesteaders and steal their land." Blackwood's face went through several shades of rage before settling on pale defeat. He straightened his torn jacket with as much dignity as he could muster and walked toward the broken doorway. "This isn't finished," he said one final time. "Yes, it is," Josette replied firmly, slipping her hand into Asa's. "We chose love over fear, and we won." As Blackwood disappeared into the morning sunlight, Josette looked around the destroyed land office, broken glass, scattered papers, bullet holes in the walls, and a terrified clerk, still clutching his pen like a weapon. But in her other hand, warm against her palm, lay the official deed to 640 acres of Colorado grassland, where she and Asa could build whatever future they dared to dream. 6 months later, Josette stood in the doorway of their half-built cabin, watching Asa guide their new plow horse through the rich Colorado soil. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and golden aspen leaves danced on the breeze like scattered coins. Their first crop of winter wheat was already sprouting in neat green rows, a testament to the fertility of land that had been worth killing for. The hand-built cabin door behind her was rough-hewn pine, fitted with leather hinges and secured with a wooden latch Asa had carved during the long evenings when winter storms kept them inside. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, the first thing they'd built together on their own land, solid and weatherproof and filled with the kind of contentment that money couldn't buy. "Coffee?" she called, and Asa waved acknowledgement without stopping his work. The plow turned the earth in long, dark furrows that would feed them through the coming winter and provide seed money for expanding their small operation. As she poured coffee from the pot that always seemed to be brewing on their wood stove, Josette reflected on how much had changed since that desperate morning in the Colorado Springs land office. The legal battle with Blackwood had continued for months, conducted through lawyers and court filings rather than guns and hired killers. But their deed was solid. Their claim was legal, and eventually even the railroad baron's vast resources couldn't overcome the simple fact that they owned the land fair and square. The railroad had been built anyway, but on a route that curved around their property rather than through it. Blackwood paid handsomely for an easement to cross one corner of their land, money that had allowed them to buy proper farming equipment and start building the future they'd dreamed of. "Ma'am?" A voice from the yard interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Colt?" She stepped outside to find a young man on horseback, dusty from travel and holding a leather mail pouch. The weekly mail delivery was one of the few connections they maintained with the outside world, bringing news from family and friends scattered across the territory. "Letter for you," the rider said, handing her an envelope that bore the familiar return address of Red Mesa. "From Samuel Hale by the look of it." Josette accepted the letter with mixed emotions. She'd written to Uncle Samuel several times since settling in Colorado, trying to repair the relationship that had been damaged by his attempt to arrange her marriage. His responses had been polite but distant, the correspondence of a man who loved his niece but couldn't quite forgive her for choosing her own path. "Thank you, Billy," she said to the mail rider. "Will you stay for coffee? Asa should be finished with his plowing soon." "Much obliged, ma'am, but I've got 6 more stops before dark." Billy touched his hat brim and rode on, leaving Josette alone with her uncle's letter. She opened it carefully, smoothing the pages on the cabin's rough table. Samuel's handwriting was as precise as ever, but his words carried a warmth that had been missing from his earlier letters. "My dear Josette," he wrote, "I hope this letter finds you and Asa in good health and high spirits. I write with news that I believe will bring you joy, though it comes at the end of a difficult chapter in our family's story. You will be pleased to know that the bank has recovered from the crisis that drove me to such desperate measures last spring. The railroad boom has brought prosperity to Red Mesa, and our depositors have returned in greater numbers than ever before. I no longer carry the burden of debt that clouded my judgment during those dark days. More importantly, I have come to understand that my attempts to secure your future through marriage to Cyrus Blackwood were not only wrong but deeply hurtful to someone I love dearly. A man should not choose security over happiness for his daughter, even when that choice comes from a place of genuine concern. I have enclosed a small gift that I hope will serve as both apology and blessing for the life you have chosen. It belonged to your grandmother, then to your mother, and now it rightfully belongs to you. May it remind you that love freely given is worth more than all the gold in Colorado territory. I remain, as always, your devoted uncle and friend, Samuel Hale. Wrapped inside the letter was a small jewelry box that Josette remembered from her childhood. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay her grandmother's wedding ring knot, the simple band she'd brought with her to Colorado. But the elaborate gold and diamond ring that had been the family's most precious heirloom. Tears blurred her vision as she slipped the ring onto her finger beside the bent horseshoe nail that Asa had fashioned during their flight across the desert. The contrast between elegant gold and rough iron seemed to tell the story of her journey from sheltered banker's daughter to frontier wife. "Good news or bad?" Asa asked, stepping through the doorway with his hands and clothes dusty from the fields. "The best," she replied, showing him the letter and the ring. "Uncle Samuel has forgiven us, more than Thaith's given us his blessing." Asa read the letter while she prepared their simple lunch of bread, cheese, and preserved vegetables from their own garden. When he finished, he looked up with a smile that still made her heart race after all these months. "Feels good to have family peace restored," he said. "Your uncle's a good man who made bad choices under pressure. Can't fault him for loving you enough to worry about your future." They ate lunch on the cabin's small porch, looking out over land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Their nearest neighbors were 8 miles away, but loneliness had never been a problem. They had each other, they had work that gave their lives meaning, and they had the daily satisfaction of building something lasting together. "Any regrets?" Asa asked, following her gaze across their valley. Josette considered the question seriously. She thought about the comfortable life she'd abandoned in Red Mesa, the social position she'd forfeited, the security she'd traded for uncertainty. Then she looked at her husband's weathered hands and kind eyes, at the cabin they'd built with their own labor, at the endless sky that promised adventures yet to come. "Only one," she said finally. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize that the hardest choices are usually the right ones." Asa leaned over to kiss her, his lips warm against hers as the Colorado wind whispered through the aspen trees. Somewhere in the distance, their horses grazed peacefully in grass that belonged to no one but them. The wagon stage had left Red Mesa 6 months ago, carrying 2 people toward an uncertain future. Now they were home, and the future looked as bright and endless as the prairie sky above their heads.